I am here with Joseph Harrington, who did the Norfolk film After the Tide. A very interesting film that's very prominent and relevant, particularly in our current ecological crisis that we are in, not just in Norfolk, but also around the world. So thank you so much for joining us today, Joe.
Thank you
Um,
for having me, Shelby.
of course. So can you start off by telling us about your film? What is it about and what can people expect when they see it?
So the film looks at a village in Norfolk, which is in the east of England. It's the little bump that kind of comes out on the map. And it has a topography which is really quite unique to the area. It's got very high cliffs that are very soft and sandy. And because of that, it has always and continues to be really vulnerable to the tide, to tidal flooding and tidal surges. So historically, we've lost a few villages on the coast that we know about, and the film specifically looks at the one particular village called Happisburgh, which is really iconic. It's the first place in the world to have the red and white lighthouse. So like when people think of lighthouses, they think of Happisburgh. And basically it looks at a couple of characters that live there who are kind of at immediate risk of losing their homes. So two of the characters at the moment, they are actually pretty much on the edge of the cliff. And the film was kind of mostly filmed 2 years ago, but they're kind of in the immediate kind of disaster area now, or the vulnerable area, rather say. And then it follows another character who's a little bit further inland and he's got a little bit more time. So it looks at how the people ended up living in this place, which I think most people wouldn't move to. Perhaps some of the preconceived notions about people that live in really areas that are really vulnerable to the natural world, to climate change, things like that. And then it also looks at England, the English government's kind of long-term plan, and kind of this big change in how we look at environmental concerns, climate change, and this kind of idea of managed retreat or managed realignment, which I think is probably quite likely that once this policy is kind of concluded and what they're doing specifically in Happisburgh is finished up, that it'll be kind of rolled out nationally. So the film's a really early insight into kind of how the UK is going to deal with some of our climate threats, specifically from kind of the coast and flooding.
I don't want to spoil the ending, but you have title cards at the end that explain, because this obviously was filmed 2 years ago, and it's the most up-to-date information. And I was very shocked. I think it was very sad to see, what is going to happen to these characters, these people whose, lives are being ruined. And it's, you open the film with your character is Bryony. She loses her house once and then she, is going and she's at that threat again. So it is a very shocking story. And I think anyone with any ounce of humanity can relate to it, even if they're not from Norfolk or they don't um, understand these people. So how did you come about this story and how did you meet this sort of cast of characters that you have going on here?
So the film comes from basically, and as kind of like every project I've worked on of any interest, it kind of started at the pub. So I was on a commercial job with a drone operator who I know quite well locally, and we were having a drink after one of our days, and he just kind of said, "Oh, like, do you do any documentary work?" I said, "Yeah, I don't know documentary work." He's like, "Oh, okay." He goes, "Oh, because my wife's family home is going to be demolished this year." And I was like, "Okay, why?" And he was like, "Well, because it's going to fall into the sea." And I was like, "What?"
Oh,
And I think actually, funny enough, but like being from this area, like I knew that it was an issue. I just kind of didn't have that connection to it. That it was, I don't know. I just kind of assumed that people's homes weren't knocked down because they were going to fall into the sea. And kind of speaking to him and him kind of telling me the background and the story and the characters, I was just like, what is going on? I thought it was absolutely kind of mind-boggling. And then also to realize that for a lot of the people that do lose their homes on the coast, there's no support for them. So that was what actually kind of really interested me. Is like, okay, well, if you buy a home here, there's no kind of, you can't get insured. The government won't protect you, and you basically get a grant for demolition, which seems really cruel. So I just thought, well, for people that lived there for 100 years, why, why is that kind of the end result? And then also to find out that the village used to have sea defenses, so it used to be protected, and then those sea defenses were taken out and not restored. I think I just felt like, well, there's obviously a huge kind of story of injustice, unfairness, kind of issues of, you know, how certain things are valued in society. So I was like, this is gonna be a great film, and kind of got completely plunged into it. And because I had a contact already in the village, Andy, who's really sweet, he introduced me to a few people he knows. So Bryony, who's probably, I'd say, the central character of the film, also kind of the most comedic relief.
Yeah,
She's absolutely hilarious, she's
so
brilliant.
charming.
She's so inspiring, and every moment with her was great fun. And it still is, like, I'm still good friends with her. And then her next door neighbor, Nicola, was also up for being in the film. And now both of these characters have done a lot of films, media, interviews before. So for me, it was really about, okay, well, they're quite high profile characters in this story. How can I kind of come in at an angle that's maybe a little bit different to what's been done before? And it was quite simple. I was like, well, an observational documentary that looks more at kind of the mental health and then also the government policy, rather than just like the doom and gloom of the village. You know, most of the films that had been made before were, look at this village, it's falling in the sea, isn't that sad, the end. So it was a bit more about kind of getting into the characters and their motivations. And then through those characters, I was also introduced to someone else in the village called Melvin, who I think is probably my favorite character because he's very sweet, has an incredibly sad story, and really gives you an understanding of someone that's not local to the area, that moves in and is kind of hoodwinked by estate agents, and the kind of the impact that that can have on someone and their health and their financial situation. And then kind of while making the film, and kind of originally it was just going to be a short little 15-20 minute film, I kind of, as I got further in, this funding package was announced by the government, and I kind of thought, well, if they're changing the policy, it would be a really good story to follow. And also it gives me the chance to understand, well, why aren't there sea defenses, and what's the actual, you know, there must be more to it than, like, there's a reason they're taking them out, right? So trying to understand a bit more about kind of the coastal topography, why certain decisions are made in government, in policy. And really, I was really lucky to work with Sophie Day in the film, who's kind of absolutely at the top of her kind of academic career in this research, knows all about it. It's been studying for years and years and years, knows all the people in the film, has a really good relationship with coastal communities, and basically broke down in the film, and to me, the long-term reality of England and other coastal places and how vulnerable they are. And that kind of, all of that got wrapped together and kind of turned into this kind of 1 hour mammoth project that I kind of, you know, started out as a 5 minute concept with in the pub with Andy, you know.
I think what I found the most interesting, and you touched on this, was the characters and the different personalities and their sort of journey in this village. It really felt like it felt sort of like a fictional story because the characters were so vibrant and they were so unique. I did really love Melvin because he was this very masculine man with this tiny little dog, and he loved his little dog. And he was very blunt and very, you know, said what he needed to say. And I think that was what was most attractive about the story, was that, yes, you could have gone from the angle of the science of it, and, you know, sort of um the impact on the environment, but it's the people that are being affected by this that really drives home that sort of emotional knife of the story. um so you discussed a little bit about the softer shorelines that are throughout different areas. You mentioned Cromer in the film. I think something that, you know, I was confused watching was why, I mean, this could just be your personal opinion. It could be the opinion of the government. So why are some of these places favored over Hasbro? Is it simply because of the size, because Cromer's bigger, or is it because the location of Cromer? Um, so I'll start with that question, if you have any opinion on that.
So if we go kind of up to the kind of far around to the Norfolk coast towards King's Lynn, so the area is a lot flatter, and you kind of come to this area called King's Lynn, which is an old port, and you kind of slowly come around North Norfolk. Now, the first kind of 20% of that land is really flat. It's called the Wash. And historically, this was kind of flooded swampland that was reclaimed. There's all reclaimed land. And that is really prone to kind of flooding and tidal drift. But the Wash goes out so far, it literally goes out for like miles, that actually it's quite easy to build fences in that area. But as we come further around the coast, what you see is these kind of big bold cliffs. And there's settlements like Cromer, like Sheringham, which are protected, that have kind of what you would see as like big concrete seawalls, many layers deep, that go to the sea. And then you also kind of have these rivets that come out into the sea as well. So a lot of money has been invested to defend those areas, and it really comes from the Victorian era. So from when a lot of these places were big tourist hotspots, so it protected local businesses and local trade and tourism. And then also after the floods of 1953, 99, that's the 53 floods. After the floods of 53 in England, basically the government put in siege fences around, kind of further around the coast, because it was so devastating to the area. Now, the reason places like Cromer and Sheringham have continued to be protected and so much money's been invested in them is basically it just comes down to a value cost analysis at the moment. So, you know, there is this much property worth this much money, or this much business, this much trade, this much, you know, to the local economy, that's worth protecting. Somewhere like Happisburgh, which is a much smaller settlement, also has a lot less properties like on the cliff edge. Like it is literally at the moment, in the 90s, there's a whole row of chalets that were demolished. But at the moment, there's just one major road called Beach Road, which kind of, as you go up the coast, there's just one house here. So I guess from the government's perspective, or from the perspective of policymakers, is, you know, you're looking at losing one home a year, one home every 2 years, every 5 years, opposed to losing like 50 and then 50 and then 50, as it kind of, for settlements that kind of stretch around the coast. So it does just come down mostly to a cost benefit analysis. It is more complicated than that. There are also many other reasons why specifically Happisburgh doesn't have siege fences, but I think the film does a really good job maybe of explaining some of those more complicated scientific factors that I'm not kind of, that I would mess up and confuse more.
Are there other places besides Norfolk around the UK that are having this sort of same threat? I think you bring some of them, you mentioned some of them in the film.
Yeah, so there's a few more in Norfolk that are quite high. There's a high profile one called Hemsby, which is a bit more complicated because that's on sandbanks. So that's, you know, just obviously harder to defend. A cliff's one thing, but sand is like, if you've got houses on sand, that's even more complicated.
Yeah.
But there's locations in Suffolk which are really vulnerable that have a similar issue. There's also places in Yorkshire. There's a specific place's kind of government trial called Coastwise or CTAP, which is being trialled in Happisburgh, is also being trialled in East Riding of Yorkshire. And there's also places in Wales. So there are many other settlements that are vulnerable, but really what it is it's just this kind of confluence of factors. And I think with things like rising sea levels, then we're going to see a much greater number of settlements affected over the coming years.
So why this story? Why did you want to tell this story to a wider audience?
So I think I had the initial kind of impression that this is probably a really rich topic that I didn't know much about, and I was interested to learn more about it. And it has so many kind of, brings up so many like powerful and really interesting themes. So I think I was really taken by that, and just like how is nothing being done? But
Yeah.
also the landscape is just so it's like, it's really beautiful, but it's also really quite terrifying. You've got these like really jagged cliffs, you've got bits of like houses on the beach, so it's quite dystopian almost. And then also over the winter periods, which is mostly when I filmed, there's like no one around.
Yeah.
So it's just this really stark landscape. And then you've got this beautiful church and lighthouse that kind of, you know, we've got these brilliant drone shots that were done, and like you just see this like beautiful lighthouse and this just absolutely desolate area. But then also, I mean, as soon as I started talking to the characters and being like, you got they're fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, they are so interested. And what I love so much about it is it was really by chance, but every single person has their own kind of like motivation and their own want and thing out the situation. So to have such kind of complicated characters within this really like stark place just made for like a really rich topic that I just delved into, you know, basically in the last 2.5 years of my life.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, the drone shots are really, really beautiful. And like you said, it is very ominous where you just see the houses and then boop, they're just gonna fall off. One of the moments that, you know, it happens pretty early in the film, Bryony goes out and measures the road, and she goes out like, you know, within a span of 10 days. And within 10 days, 2 meters of the road had fallen off. And it's just like, crazy to think like, you know, she's literally watching like the road to her house fall into the sea. And it's really terrifying and scary. And I wouldn't want I wouldn't want to live there. I'd be terrified. Um,
Well, I think just on that point, that's one thing that does make it even more, I think, interesting is that the rate of erosion is really unpredictable. So
yeah.
you'll have a moment like in 10 days, 2 meters will be lost. And you'll think, wow, at this rate, my house will be gone by summer.
Uh-huh.
It'll be gone in 3 months. But then you might not have anything. You might have 10 centimeters for 4 months. And then
Mhm.
suddenly there'll be a storm, and then another 5 meters, a couple of meters will go from here or there. So it is, and actually with Bryony's character specifically, that measuring is a really great insight into her character, because that's kind of her way of kind of controlling and also like documenting this process and kind of this injustice. So yeah, I think it's a really nice little character trait of hers that kind of, it's a great thing about doing documentaries. You wouldn't write that into a story, but there's someone that does that, that
Yeah.
kind of marks off how close it's coming to their home kind of every week. And you know
So what are your hopes for this film? What do you want audiences to take away when they see this?
I think for me, I think it's a really, from kind of my documentary perspective, I think it's a really insight into characters, a set of characters in a really vulnerable situation and how they kind of react to that situation and kind of this impending doom. I think as a character study, it's a really, that you can get a lot from it. But also, I mean, it's got a lot of scientific value to it as well. So I think, for people that are maybe ecologically concerned about climate, about the environment, it's a really good insight into perhaps some of the ways we could move away from, or how we could kind of adapt for the future, and some of the arguments around that topic. So whether we should defend or whether we should move. I think this is a big contrast that will become heightened over the years as it becomes more apparent to the general public and the media pay more attention to it. So really what I want people to take away is that, this kind of impending doom of climate change, it's kind of now,
Yeah.
like there's a lot of examples of kind of climate refugees now, even in kind of quite wealthy countries like the UK. So I just kind of hope that people reflect on that and then maybe think about how they want their government to respond. Are you the kind of person where you think we should fight against this and we should be putting in defenses, or are you the kind of person that thinks we should move and go
Mm.
and adapt to the environment? So I think there's a lot that people can get out of the film and take away from it.
One of the characters said something along the lines of, I knew this was a problem, but I didn't think that this was going to be a problem for me. I thought it was going to be a problem for future generations. I didn't think I was going to be impacted by it. And, it very much does show that the climate crisis is right now. And, it's a matter of we need to act now in order to preserve, not even just for future generations, but for ourselves, 'cause the planet's going to blow up any minute.
The professor in the film, Sophie, makes a really, I think one of my favorite comments she makes is at the end of the film, where she says kind of all these people that are going to lose their homes, where are we going to put them?
Yeah.
And it's a really simple throwaway line that she said in her interview, where she's just like kind of like looking up and she's just kind of thinking, she's like, what are we going to do with these people? And it's a really important point. You think, well, eventually certain parts, especially in England, certain parts are going to be flooded forever, and certain homes. And so what are we going to do with all these people? It's a really
Yeah.
good point. Like where I live close to a river that will be flooded one day, that's below sea level. And so where will me and my family go if that happens in my lifetime? And when people, especially when people kind of our generation move into retirement age, right? If your home is suddenly worth nothing, you can't go and buy a house up north where it's well known. So, you know, I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think it's a really interesting question to pose and to contemplate of how we kind of adapt to this as a society.
Hmm. So at the time of recording this, there's a general election coming up. And obviously politics and the government's policies are discussed in this film. As someone who has spent time in the lives of these people, and getting to know directly the issues, um, what government action do you want to see happen in Hasbro, and what do you want possibly, this is a good opportunity to, have other people hear about what's going on here and how they can sort of ask for action from their
Mm.
politicians.
Yeah, I think it's really hard because you do have this kind of juxtaposition between, the academics that will say like nothing can be done and nothing should be done for X, Y, and Z. And on the flip side, you have the local people that say we want something done. We don't really know what that looks like. Like some of us want seed fences, some of us just want to be given a new house, but we want something. I don't think fundamentally it doesn't really matter in terms of who's elected on whether there'll be a policy change. Like none of the major parties are talking about this as an issue.
Mm.
Generally the issues that are most important now are public services and housing and cost of living crisis. So I don't think it's going to matter so much what kind of how the election pans out. But what I do want to see is I do want government to take a more long-term approach, and I think things like the CTAP project are a way for them to say, well, we're investing this money here and we're going to try and work out a long-term plan. And I think if those people in those communities felt a bit more heard by their government, I think that would make a massive difference. One of the big issues that places like Happisburgh face, places like Hemsby, places all across the country, is that you have these coastal communities that are really vulnerable. People are losing their homes and they're kind of just fed up. They feel like they've been ignored, abandoned. They don't trust government. They don't trust local officials. They don't trust the engineers. They don't trust the experts. It's almost like the same thing with COVID. Like you have these people that are so fed up because no one's listening to them. And so I think what would make a massive difference, I think if the next prime minister could go and visit some of these communities and say, look, here's the reason we're not going to spend all this money on siege fences, but we hear you and we want to find a solution, that would make a massive difference. So as a minimum, what I would like is just a bit more government awareness and a bit more chit chat in the media about this subject, and for the people that live there to be taken seriously and not seen as kind of silly for buying a house on the edge of the cliff.
Mm. So you recently had a screening of the film in Hasbro. How did the community respond to it?
It was quite mixed.
Oh,
So we
okay.
had,
That's
yeah.
surprising.
So it wasn't negative. It's just
Yeah.
there's talking about this kind of distrust. There's
Mm.
lots of distrust in the community. So lots of films are made about Happisburgh, or have been made about Happisburgh, and there's big opinion in the village about whether or not that's good. Now, I would argue that it's always important to document people's lives and stories. I think it's amazing that these three characters in the film have been immortalized, and their story is kind of, or the four characters rather, their stories, opinions, and thing is there forever. And I think that has inherent value in it outside of the issue. But for people living in the village, it's probably a bit annoying having cameras in there all the time, TV presenters looking through your window, people like me trying to wave you down for an interview. So I completely understand some of that. And I think also, there is an issue and I think, the film talks about it and it's really difficult. But for the people, if you live there, if you live in Happisburgh and you can't sell your house now, or your house prices have been kind of dropped because of all the media attention, and that does have real world impacts on you as well. So I can understand why people get fed up and bitter and a bit annoyed that, their house fell through, because that's really stressful. Now, the question of whether they should be able to sell their house in the first place, I think, is a big question that it should be, but fundamentally, I think, it was really positive that it kind of gave an insight to some of the people in the village of these characters. And I think it was generally well received. But we've had other screenings like in Sheringham, which is another coastal community, which has big sea defences, and it got like amazing reception. So I think it's really interesting, right? It's for a community that's really conflicted about a subject, that's
Yeah.
maybe not, it's the most interesting place to screen it, but not necessarily where you're going to get the biggest round of applause at the end,
Yeah.
or the biggest thumbs up.
Interesting. I was not expecting that answer.
Well, I just, that's the amazing thing about making
Yeah.
films, right? Or making any piece of art or anything that people can judge, is you could show it over here and people love it, and then you show it over there and people are like, yeah, can you stop doing that, please? Because it's actually
Yeah.
really annoying,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Um, so just wrapping up the interview now. So at Film East, we work with a lot of young people who are interested in film, and we often get people coming to us saying, "How do I start?" filmmaking. How do I make a movie? So we're not a filmmaking organization, and I always have to unfortunately turn them away because I have never made a film in my life, and I have no intention of making a film in my life. So whenever we get this opportunity to interview creatives or filmmakers, I always like to end on this sort of question, to have a sort of resource building, that I can provide to these people,
Of
um, who
course.
who want to start their career as a filmmaker. So what do you say to someone, who just wants to make a film and doesn't know where to start? So this is very interesting, especially as a documentarian, um, because I feel like documentaries is more of an accessible way into filmmaking than sort of a feature-length film.
I think documentary is probably the most accessible. I think you're right, because it just requires so much less manpower and women
Mhm.
power. And I think that's really important to keep in mind if you're starting out your career. I still kind of can't believe that we've done this, but we've done this kind of completely unfunded in our spare time, with like, it's basically me, producer Evie, basically doing the whole thing.
Yeah.
That's why it's taken us kind of nearly 3 years. It's not a normal way to make a film or documentary, but I think I've proven to myself and also to other people that are coming up that if you've got an idea that you're passionate about, there really isn't anything stopping you from doing it other than kind of your own procrastination. So I would say to anyone that's really keen to get into the industry or to make their own films is just to put everything into it. And it is really hard. It's incredibly lonely. It's really stressful as well, but it is really rewarding. And, if I could say to myself 5 years ago, just keep going. I mean, the amount of projects that I've started and not finished and feel awful about because I just couldn't quite get the pieces together. It is really tough, but I think you just always have to think about kind of your 20, 30 year um plan. So I would just say to anyone that wants to do it, just crack on and get on with it. And I used to hate it at uni because teachers would say to us, they'd go, anyone can make a film with an iPhone. And I'd be like, well,
Uh-huh.
that's stupid. But actually it's really true.
Yeah.
So, I think just if you've got a story you're really passionate about, just start telling it. And people will come. I mean, I've proven it to myself with this film. It's now been screened. We're doing our fourth screening today. 150 people are coming. And these
Amazing.
aren't people that I've messaged to say come. These are just people that have come because they've heard about the film and it's been advertised. So you can do it even if you've got no budget. I mean, our biggest expense was probably petrol for the car. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah, no, that's an amazing turnout, especially, with the cinema multiplex, people aren't going to the cinema anymore. So that's a really fantastic turnout. Is there anything else you would like to add, Joe, before we wrap this up?
No, I think no, it's been really lovely to talk about the film. I think it's a really interesting story. And for anyone that wants to watch the film, I guess I could say, we're in talks with Journeyman Pictures at the moment, who have acquired the film. So at some point, I can't say when, it will be out in the wider world. You can find the film on Journeyman. So if you go to Journeyman Pictures / After the Tide, we are on there. So they have updates on there. Thank you very much, Shelby.
Thank you so much, Joe.